In 1961, 7 of the world's richest central banks made a pact to fix the price of gold. By 1968, it was in pieces. The London gold pool wasn't a conspiracy, it was a desperate act of cooperation. After World War II, the United States had promised that any foreign government could walk into Fort Knox and swap dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. Sounds simple. It wasn't, because by the late 1950s, Americans were spending dollars overseas faster than the Treasury could back them with actual gold. The math was breaking. Exhibit 1, the drain was real. Between 1958 and 1960, American gold reserves fell by roughly $3 billion. That doesn't sound dramatic until you remember this was when $3 billion was enough to bankrupt a nation's credibility. European central banks were calling in their dollars and demanding the precious metal. The US government was hemorrhaging gold, and everybody knew it. So in October 1961, the Bank of England pulled together a quiet room with the central banks of Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the United States. The goal was simple: stop the price of gold from rising. Why? Because if gold's price climbed above $35, it would prove the dollar was worth less than advertised. The whole Bretton Woods system, the post-war monetary order, would crack. Exhibit 2, the mechanism. When gold threatened to break above $35 on the open market, these banks would quietly sell their own reserves to push the price back down. Flood the market, kill demand, simple supply and demand carpentry. It worked because central banks had something private investors didn't: enough gold to actually move the needle. For 6 years, the pool held. But here's what the central bankers didn't account for: they weren't the only players. Private speculators and investors around the world, dentists, jewelry makers, hoarders, and actual speculators, all began stockpiling gold. Why? Because they could smell what the bankers were denying: the dollar was weakening. If you could buy gold at $35 today and it would be worth more tomorrow, the math was free money. Exhibit 3, the pressure mounted. By 1965, demand was so intense that the pool had to sell 2,000 tons of gold just to keep the price stable. 2,000 tons. That's a number worth sitting with. The banks were burning through their reserves to defend a fiction. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started openly questioning whether the dollar deserved its privileged status. Cracks were showing. Then came 1967. The British pound collapsed. Investors panicked. If the pound wasn't safe, what was? They turned to gold, the one thing no government could print. Demand exploded. The pool tried to hold the line. Sold more, then more. The central banks were now selling gold at fire sale rates to defend a price they'd collectively agreed on. It was absurd, and they knew it. By early March 1968, the pool was finished. On March 14th, the central banks met and admitted what everyone already knew: they couldn't control the price of gold. They couldn't fight the market. They couldn't print their way out, so they did what governments do: they split the market in two. Exhibit 4, the two-tier system. From that day forward, there was an official price of gold, $35 per ounce, maintained between governments only. And then there was the real price, the market price, which would float freely for everyone else. It was a surrender dressed up as innovation. The central banks could pretend the dollar was still golden. Private investors could trade in reality. Within months, the real price of gold began climbing, not dramatically at first, but it moved. By 1971, President Nixon would formally abandon the $35 peg entirely. The Bretton Woods system, that whole post-war monetary order, collapsed. The dollar was no longer as good as gold. It was just dollars. So what does this tell us? Central banks aren't stupid. Nobody in this story is stupid. Look at what they were paid to see. The pool's members understood economics. They understood markets. But they were defending something that had already died: the idea that governments could freeze reality in place. You can't. Markets punished the attempt. The London gold pool lasted 7 years. It cost the participating central banks roughly $75 billion in gold sales. In exchange, they bought time, not victory. They learned what every government learns eventually: you can't negotiate with supply and demand. You can only choose which side you're on. And that's the real story of the Vanishing Act. Not that central banks failed to control gold. That's obvious. The story is why they tried. They tried because the alternative, admitting the dollar was weakening, would have shattered the entire post-war system overnight. Sometimes the biggest conspiracies aren't secret. They're just collective denial. The pool's failure teaches a harder lesson than simple market mechanics. It shows what happens when institutions mistake their own authority for economic law. The bankers believed they controlled the price. They didn't. They only controlled the official lie. The market was always the truth. they just weren't paying attention. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. If you're interested in how wealth systems break down and rebuild themselves, subscribe. There's a new unsolved case in economic history every week. Subscribe, there's a new unsolved case in economic history every week. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.